I'm an innocent man. I'll be back. Those were the words uttered by Grant Williams in 1998 after being convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 to life. Now, more than 2 decades later, his claim rings true, as the courts have overturned his sentencing in what was the first successful wrongful conviction case in Staten Island history. Welcome to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene, a podcast bringing you an inside look at the biggest stories on Staten Island with the reporters who cover them. I'm your host, Erik Bascome, and this week I'm joined by breaking news reporter Joseph Ostapiuk to discuss the exoneration of Grant Williams, a Staten Island man who was sentenced to 25 years to life in 1998 for a murder that prosecutors now say he didn't commit. Thanks for joining me today, Joe, to discuss one of the most interesting court cases in recent borough history, really.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was definitely something that's unprecedented on the borough, for sure.
Yeah, well, let's get started by giving the listeners some context before we kind of dive deeper into some of the specifics of this case. So, last week you attended the wrongful conviction hearing for Grant Williams, who served more than 2 decades in prison for a crime that they're now saying he did not actually commit. So, can you give us a brief overview of the case?
Sure. So we're going to go back to 1996 to sort of get started. It was April 5th, 1996, in front of the Stapleton houses at around 6 p.m. when Shadell Lewis, who was 20 years old at the time, was shot by a gunman. At the time, police locked in on Grant Williams as a suspect. He was later arrested and then convicted in 1997 after a trial, and then in 1998 was sentenced to 25 to life.
So let's dig into some of the details here. What can you tell us about that murder that took place in 1996? What happened? What did police say at the time?
So immediately after the shooting, the shooter fled the scene, and 2 NYPD officers arrived to the area and began a foot pursuit. The perpetrator escaped through a courtyard before running into a building with an automatic locking door. It basically cut police off from the chase. A baseball hat with the Wu-Tang logo at the time fell off the perpetrator, and it was later recovered by police. Police began asking people in the area, witnesses, what they had seen. A 17-year-old witness told investigators at the time there was an ongoing turf war between some rival crews in the area, and there was a possible motive for the fatal shooting. They said it may have been retaliation for an earlier incident between Mr. Lewis and a man nicknamed Boo Boo. Boo Boo, after a while, police ran it through their database, and it was linked to Grant Williams as his nickname. So that's basically how it started. Williams was arrested after that.
Now, let's talk about some of the concerns that there were with this initial trial, right? That's kind of how we ended up at this wrongful conviction place, where there was some concerns about the criminal justice process, including some excluded interviews during the original trial, police procedures that they're saying don't meet modern investigative standards. Can you walk us through some of these issues that we saw back there, in the late 90s when this thing was still in trial?
For sure. I mean, I think a good way to start this is what Mr. Williams said when he left court, last week after this case, and he said he didn't think he was going to be convicted. He told me that initially when he was arrested, he thought that he would eventually be let go because he knew that he didn't do this crime. And then all of a sudden things started to pile up. All of a sudden he's going to trial. All of a sudden they're talking about it at trial. And he realized, what's going on here?
I didn't think I was going to blow trial. I didn't think I was going to be convicted.
After more than 2 decades in prison, Grant Williams is now 50 years old.
So I thought, all right, they'll find the right guy, All of a sudden, they said, bring out the first panel. I said, what's the first panel? We all jurors.
So he had a lot of concerns very, very early on. His attorney at the time, Felix Gilroy, argued that his client had been the victim of a mistaken identity, and the prosecution had a number of inconsistencies. Police communications at the time, which were brought up in court, indicated an officer was chasing the gunman, who was described as a heavy-set male standing around 5 foot 5 inches tall. Williams, I saw him in court not too long ago. I'm 6 feet tall. He's probably a couple inches taller than me. Definitely not heavy-set. So, and I was told that was basically the same build he had, a little over 2 decades ago. Additionally, Gilroy at the time said that the lead investigator in the case was doing things that just didn't line up with how that they should have been doing it, including police lineups. Police lineups, as we know, are used to basically have witnesses identify people who were at the scene. That 17-year-old witness that they discussed, they got Grant Williams' nickname from that witness, and they sort of worked backwards, prosecutors now say. They got his picture and then used that for lineups, and they said that it was suggestive and unfair at the time. These were concerns that were brought up in the initial trial way back when, but just didn't gather enough steam to overturn this. And at the time, Williams was a very close friend with the Wu-Tang Clan. He was actually working at the studio, and that Wu-Tang hat that dropped off the gunman's head was used to sort of connect him to the scene, though that's a very thin argument. And this wasn't lost on the jurors. The jurors had some concerns as well. They were deadlocked, and they actually wrote to the judge while they were trying to deliberate this, saying, quote, "We are hopelessly deadlocked." And it took 2 days for them to come to a decision, and that's when they ended up convicting him of second-degree murder.
So now, we're 25 years later, the conviction has been successfully overturned. But with decades having passed since the sentencing, what prompted the DA's office to reevaluate this case now? And why did it take so long for them to do so?
For sure, that's a great question. So it doesn't really start with the DA's office. I think it's important to mention. Irvin Cohen, who's Williams' current lawyer, was contacted by Williams about 8 years ago. And Cohen said the information that he received and the conversations he had with Williams demonstrated to him that this was, in all likelihood, an innocent man who was imprisoned. So Cohen and his team start to gather evidence. They know that if they're going to bring this case to a district attorney's to overturn a conviction, which is an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do, he's going to have very, very solid evidence. So Cohen and his team start to gather evidence, and in about May 2017, he contacts District Attorney McMahon's office with new information that casts doubt on the identification of Williams as the shooter, including over a dozen witnesses who gained sworn affidavits attesting to his innocence and some other information as well.
Grant's case presented the usual difficulties in convincing a judge, or, as in this case, a district attorney, that a person found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury is actually, factually, and conclusively innocent.
Irvin Cohen is Grant Williams' attorney.
In this case, after several years, I presented sufficient documentation to strongly suggest that Grant was unjustly convicted. I was convinced, obviously, as soon as I read his records, as soon as I met him. But I needed to convince the district attorney's office.
So that then prompts McMahon's office to launch a preliminary investigation into the case. He has a unit called the Conviction Integrity Review Unit that basically looks at these wrongful conviction cases and other cases as well, and looks to see if there's any water in the proposal. So they furthered the probe. Cohen already started. They interviewed over 50 people, went to 7 states, 5 different correctional facilities in connection to the review. And they found exculpatory evidence that wasn't included in the initial trial, and they found a lot of concerns with that initial trial and that investigation. And in the end, they found that the prosecution didn't use best practices for ensuring a fair and an impartial trial, and that the NYPD original investigation had some issues as well, including that 17-year-old's testimony, which we mentioned earlier. It changed multiple times. And authorities say now that that individual was warned that if he didn't cooperate with the investigation, that he would have further issues. But still, there were challenges. Evidence no longer existed. As you mentioned, we're talking about 2 decades of time, a long time since the incident. People are all over the place now. It's much easier to prosecute this stuff in the immediate aftermath of it. But there were a lot of challenges. So getting to this point definitely is a significant event.
Yeah, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what you saw in the courtroom. As anyone can imagine, Williams' exoneration was obviously an incredibly emotional moment for both he and his family. So since you were fortunate enough to be one of those people in the courtroom at the time, what can you tell us about kind of the emotional outpouring that you saw from him and his family?
Yeah, his mother, who was a few rows behind him, was sitting next to his son. And she was emotional. She was being consoled by his son. And he was so excited. His lawyer was so excited. They were hugging, high-fiving. Listen, even McMahon and his team, they were excited too. There was a very unique sort of feeling in a courtroom that doesn't normally happen. There was both sides that were very happy. There were strong words said about, the powers of prosecutors, and that this man lost over 2 decades of his life for something that prosecutors now say he didn't do. So it was emotional. There was a lot of emotions going on from Grant too. He was just excited to finally have his name cleared. He had been out on parole in 2019 after the district attorney's office wrote a letter to the state parole board saying that they had no issue with him being released. So he had been out for a little bit, but getting his name cleared was something that was a long, long time coming.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, obviously everyone was very excited, but he did still spend, over 2 decades behind bars for a crime that he didn't commit. So what did Williams say about that time that he spent in prison, and how did he manage to kind of maintain hope that one day his name would be cleared?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most remarkable things about this entire situation, was that Williams just was an incredibly positive, upbeat presence throughout court, but you could also tell that he carried that with him every day that he was in prison.
There's a lot of joy in my heart right now. I went through a lot of pain. I want to thank my family, everybody that's here, my friends that have been supportive, and my lawyer. When I met him, he brought more hope in my life that I would be free. I never gave up anyway. So when I wrote him and I told him about the wrongful conviction, I used to tell everybody in prison, I'm innocent. They say, oh, Williams, you always, everybody says that. I said, I'm telling you the truth. One day you're going to see me on the news, and you're going to see that I was innocent, right? And today's that day.
I think that he stayed resolute throughout the entire thing. He said he really never lost hope that he would be proven innocent one day. And that was something that was just remarkable to see. This wasn't a man that was bitter. This wasn't a man that was holding things in and harboring ill emotion. He was just very resolute, and that's partially the reason why he was able to prove his innocence, because he was the one that was reaching out to Mr. Cohen to get this case overturned. He was very, very steadfast in trying to get this overturned, and I'm not sure he thought it was going to take this long, but I think this is something that that he was happy it finally happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned earlier, it feels like something that was a long time coming. And, you spoke earlier a little bit about how this decision to overturn the conviction came after an investigation by District Attorney Michael McMahon's Conviction Integrity Review Unit. So what did McMahon have to say about this case specifically, and what law enforcement officials and prosecutors can maybe learn from this moving forward?
Yeah, I think to start, McMahon did his absolute best to make sure that this was all about Grant. This was Grant's day, he said, when they came out of court. But he also mentioned that this is obviously a very, very important day for Staten Island, too. This is the first time a wrongful conviction case has been overturned on the borough. But he also sort of had an introspective look. As a prosecutor, he obviously tries to put people behind bars when he believes that they committed a crime. But he said that this should also humble prosecutors and realize how important their job is and how powerful they are and how they can change people's lives.
This is an historic moment for Staten Island, but it's not about that, but let me speak to it, because this is Grant's moment. I want to be very, very clear about that.
Michael McMahon is the Staten Island District Attorney.
But this is also Staten Island's moment, because this is the first time in the history of the Staten Island criminal justice system that a look back was taken and an injustice was undone and a motion was made and granted to overturn a wrongful conviction, and it's a great day for Staten Island.
But he made it clear that the things that they learned, he hoped that they would ensure, that they would inform his office to ensure this never happens again. He said that this would never happen while he was in office. So I think that was an important thing that he basically took away from this, that prosecutors have an immense amount of power. And in this case, the sort of speedy way that Williams was, first of all, identified as a suspect and then put behind bars was something that they definitely lamented and wish hadn't happened.
And as you know, on this podcast, we like to not only discuss these major stories, but also kind of dig into the reporting process and what this can be like, and kind of bring some of our listeners behind the scenes. So I'm curious, as a breaking news reporter, you're used to responding to events in real time, covering fires, car accidents, shootings. So what's it like covering a major court case as opposed to responding to breaking news as you typically do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think there's obviously a much more formal feel to being in the courtroom. You sort of feel like you're going all over the place when you're on a breaking news scene, talking to neighbors or talking to witnesses. I think the main difference for me is that being in a courtroom it's where the rubber meets the road. Breaking news scenes are usually the initial stages of an investigation. Police are trying to figure out what happened. We're trying to figure out what happened. But when you get to court, things are either in the process of that finishing up or they already have finished. This was unique entirely because I had never been in the courtroom when somebody's wrongful conviction case, nonetheless somebody's wrongful conviction case that put him in jail for 20 years, was overturned. So I think that, to me, that was just I don't even really have a comparable, to be honest, and I'm not sure I ever will again. So, I mean, that's something that was just, it was unprecedented to see and to just be in the room. And I sort of joked afterwards and that both sides were leaving the courtroom smiling, hugging, and sort of on the same page. And that very, very seldom, actually, I'll say never happens, in a courtroom. Usually somebody's leaving unhappy. But this was one of those unique situations where everybody just sort of feels good about the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as they all should in this case. So let's look forward a little bit. Now that Williams' conviction has been overturned, what's next for him as he starts to reacclimate to life as a free man?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he mentioned it himself. He has a lot he wants to do. And a lot to do. He mentioned that he has 3 children, at the moment, but only one of them were actually there to see his sentence overturned. He just sort of mentioned that to sort of show where he is at this moment in his life, that he has relationships he has to repair. He has a lot of work to do, he said, which is something that he definitely didn't shy away from when he left court.
Future's very bright, very, very, very bright. Just like I was telling everybody, even before I was released, that my focus on my life is to spread my message to everybody. I don't want nobody to ever endure the pain that I had endured for the last decade and a half. Because it's incredible. A lot of people don't make it.
But something that he wants to do is speak to children. He definitely doesn't want his case to just sort of go away at this point. He wants to embrace it. He wants to speak to people who have been through the criminal justice system, and he wants to sort of give them an opportunity to change their lives around. And he wants to be a positive impact to them and do some things. And based on how many people came there to support him, I think he has a lot of people on his team here, and I think that's going to be it's probably going to go a long way for him as he spends these first months and years. He's only 50 years old. He has a long way to go. So he has a lot of time left to change the narrative and really make a positive impact. And that's what it seems like he's going to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Joe. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Erik. Appreciate you.
Did you know St. Peter's in New Brighton, Staten Island's first Roman Catholic parish, was established in 1839? Thank you for listening to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene. If you like what you've heard, please make sure to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit silive.com for the latest on all these stories and more. Thank you for supporting local journalism.
What's new in podcasting? Here's what we love, courtesy of Acast Recommends.
Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony Ames, aka Nippy, husband and co-host.
And we're here to talk about things that are just a little bit culty. We were in a cult. We got out, and it was all captured in the HBO docuseries, The Vow.
Now we're here to have frank conversations about how to spot trouble and how to recover if something culty happens to you.
We are back with season 2 of our show, A Little Bit Culty. This season, we sit down with the likes of Roberta Blevins from Amazon's docuseries Lula Rich, Elizabeth Gilpin, author of the memoir Stolen, and Amanda Montell, linguist and author of Cultish, and so many more. Listen to A Little Bit Culty wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Learn more about us on Instagram or at alittlebitculty.com.
Acast
recommends.